So the question today is what makes a family portrait? And I'm going to try and reveal some of my feelings of what makes a good family portrait photographer. But of course, it all depends on who you are and where you're photographing. Since the late 1980s, when I opened the first studio, I've been photographing families commercially. So in other words, I've been looking at how much money I can earn from the family by shooting the variety that not only suits what they might think they want, but also what I know kind of really sells well. So very, very commercially minded as such. But whether I'm photographing in studio, on location, down at the beach, or in a client's home, I've obviously got to kind of change and adapt my styling to suit them. One of the things I shot a lot of at the beginning of my career, I just kind of mimicked what others were doing. So it was more of an old master style of photography. Dark backgrounds, planting the corner, old chair. And within probably about 18 months, 2 years, I realized that what I was photographing was not something that I would actually aspire to buy. And as a young family man myself then in my 20s, I began to actually explore, well, what do we actually want to kind of put up in our own home? And I know it's hard to believe, but there was once upon a time when you couldn't just go on Google and kind of really look at things. You had to physically look at magazines, or you had to look in books, or you'd go down the local high street, and whatever it was, it's kind of, what am I seeing? What am I doing? And one of the key things was a company called Benetton, and they kind of were showing different cultures and different styling in a commercial sense. They were a clothing company, and I absolutely fell in love with this clean white light space that in the commercial sense they were doing. And then I began to lean on my commercial training in lighting, even though I was working in a very small studio space, to start to create and use what is referred to as high key photography. In other words, white and light backgrounds. Now, when we were kind of putting everything together, you began to actually think, well, light background, like clothing and so on. But if you're in a commercial sense, you know, the client or the models could wear exactly what they wanted, and on a white background they were easy to cut out, separate and so on with it. And pretty much what I began to do was start to kind of develop a technique that would work in a small studio space for me, because in these times we were photographing on film. And, you know, it's just not like going into Photoshop where you can kind of clean up a white background within seconds nowadays. We had to really do it with all the lighting. Plus, we couldn't really afford flare to come back and so on. And that was one benefit for me as a portrait photographer, that a lot of photographers wouldn't risk it, or they couldn't do it. Whichever it was, we kind of developed a high key, a light and bright studio kind of portrait photography for families and kids that pretty much followed me through the rest of my career. Now, it doesn't mean that I didn't shoot the kind of the old style, and I still mixed it in. So in other words, a slightly mid or a lower key style of photography with kind of old master backdrops and one light and so on. But at the heart of what I was doing was that was lighting was key, animation was secondary, and then basically expression was the kind of the last thing in the equation, but really the first thing in the equation, because you soon realize that as a commercial family photographer, in other words, somebody's on the high street that's photographing 5, 6, 7 families on a Saturday, it's really more about the expression than it is anything else. However, thank goodness to a way to some of my mentors, where they were classical portrait photographers in studio, I learned a lot about body animation, posing, and kind of how you could quickly jigsaw big groups together to make everybody fit within the scene and everything else with it. So for me, the white and the light and the bright was something that I kind of was able to separate myself away from, but it didn't mean that I excluded a lower key in a part of the shoot. Then in the film days, we liked to present a client with about 48 photographs, which was technically 4 rolls of film. 12 on. And then I was also allowed another roll of film in black and white to kind of shoot. In fact, that soon changed by the kind of the beginning of the 90s, where I was photographing about half the family shoot in black and white and half the shoot in color, with two different distinct styles, without a doubt. The black and white photography develops into a little bit more of a lifestyle, might be referred to today, or kind of a fashionista, kind of mid-tone backgrounds, dark clothing, separation lights to make sure they separated themselves away from the background, of course, but concentrate on just the one light. But then I kind of really got into how do they interact together and how do we bring more energy into a shoot. At this stage, I'm into my 30s, so basically I need to actually represent me. And at this stage, probably the families in front of me were more like me than ever before. But by the time we got to Studio 2 in 95, pretty much my style was nailed into the look and the feel of majority of shoots were high key, with at least half of the shoot being in black and white, but those were the lower key images. And I was then beginning to input much more energy and expression and jump in and so on with it. And I began to look more and more at what the client and who the client was than what I needed them to wear to make it right for me. So bringing out their character. And at this stage, I also introduced a lot of discussion with the client in advance to really make sure I was preparing them and what to bring in with them, as well as actually preparing myself of what to expect. And that also goes alongside my other photographers who were working for me at the time to ensure that they were producing studio style, but still being given the freedom and energy to kind of go into the studio and create what they wanted to do as such. So when we start to look at the images of, today, tomorrow, and so on with it, I think you've got to really find what fits with you. But I would say variety is key. The image that we're seeing on screen now is a simple high key image. Pretty much we can do it anywhere, anytime, whether we're working at an event photographer, whether we're setting up in a client's home with a kind of a reverse background, in other words, where the light's coming back from reverse, or in a studio space, a converted garage, whatever it would be. But the family portrait photography should be simply put together, making sure we're animating the body pose to kind of slightly slim them out more and more, to basically make sure they all fit into the real estate of the studio space in the least amount of way. Slimming is good as well, because obviously everybody likes to think of themselves a little bit slimmer. And then from there, the simple animation of what hands are doing, what feet are doing, and everything else. But as I was saying to you, the last thing, but the first thing is going to be the expression, because that's really what does sell it. I also think that a client doesn't have to fully look at the camera the whole time. So even though a lot of the photographs that we're seeing today in a future session will look at variety of a session and actually see a kind of the real shoot flow going throughout and things. So when we then start to look at a little bit more of an old master, okay, this is a bit funkier because I've got a checkered floor. This could be a dark grey floor, wooden floor, whatever it is. What I would say though is whatever props you're using within your business, within your studio space, make sure they're kind of usable, or kind of they'll look good in a client's home. I honestly think that my red sofa is less attractive to many clients than it would be if it was a simple dark sofa. In this case, because everything within the scene, the grey background, the black and white flooring, that sofa should theoretically be in the dark kind of greys or light blacks and so on with it. But red is a very dominant colour. It's okay if it's in the client's home and it's their sofa, but by putting a prop into a scene where it's dominating a scene through colour, this could restrict the wall image. So I would definitely think long and hard about the kind of the props that you're bringing into the image. But things like a sofa, a table, stools, make it as natural as you can within a studio environment. And obviously if you're working in a client's own home, try and use their furniture to really make that together. But what props do for me is allow us to change the heights of the subject to allow us to kind of move the eyes off the same kind of level and plane. So by doing that alone, or with a tilt of a head can even change the height of the eyes. It just allows things to kind of fit more and more together. But when you're setting up your studio initially and you're just exploring ideas, try and keep the color palette as simple as you can, and try and make the light in a three-dimensional element. So in other words, you're seeing separation light here coming in from the 12 o'clock reverse, and basically we've got one big key light coming in from the left-hand side with a little bit of a fill light kind of going on behind camera position, where we compare to the image beforehand where we've got two lights onto the background and one light actually onto the subject themselves, again with no fill light being used. So as far as the styling is concerned, we can see two dynamic differences there. But I mentioned to you about the storytelling elements that I like to bring through the character of the client. And this kind of imagery, even though we set this up for a kind of a demonstration shoot that we were doing, this will give you an idea of, if you put the effort in, or if you dare to do it, it kind of can really produce some amazing images for you. And even though this is the kind of the relaxed before the storm, in other words, before they start throwing flour and fruit and everything else and popcorn in the shoot, and we change the background color, this will give you a good idea of how you can really bring more of a commercial storytelling in within your photograph. And I definitely encourage you to explore this if you're a full-time portrait photographer of families. It'll make you a little bit different and separate you away from the rest. You can, of course, start to explore things like here, where we're kind of got more of a Vanity Fair kind of separation. There's work to do, kind of cropping off a radiator to the left and plug points to the right and things really. But again, a family here, big family setup as well, kind of is quite dynamic, and we're going to need a lot more kind of attention to the detail of the light. So one light cannot do all here. We have to have one light to light the girls on the right. We have to have another light to light the people on the left, and we've got to have another light to actually light the couple in the middle. Then as far as the positioning and the animation, if all we're really left to is the likes of being stood up, then obviously we've got to try and bring some energy into the pose, the animation of the pose, from the feet upwards to really kind of start to kind of bring out a little bit more character. But here, for instance, this is a big depth of field to be able to even try and get these kind of pin sharp with it and things, F22 and the likes, to actually kind of get the full depth. But it just gives you a little bit more kind of idea for variety. And I would say that if you're trying to change your portrait, your family portrait photography away from a normal, in other words, you feel like you're a bit on a conveyor belt, then perhaps explore things like a commercial Vanity Fair grouping or whatever it is, and just have a little bit of a play with it. Once again, we'll explore a more creative, dynamic family shoot in a future film. For me, though, when I talk about animation and fun and everything else, even though the baby is definitely getting a little bit too squashed for the shoot here, yeah, this kind of really shows that it is full of energy. And you could pick up this image and transport it back through my decades in photography, and we would be saying something similar from, as I said, the late 80s, early 90s onwards to the present day. I'm all about the expression and fun, and they don't always have to look at camera. And I would expect that during my shoot, that I'm creating at least 1/3 of the session where they are not looking at the camera in any way. I want them interacting together rather than having a relationship with me, as it were. But I would say that if you're trying to bring a little bit more of a lifestyle, you've got to nail the expressions, because, okay, I know the baby, I'm going to be punishing me about the baby missing here, kind of being hidden by dad's head and everything else with it. But he wasn't expecting the little blonde boy in the middle to jump on him from behind and push his head down and so on with it. But I can promise you, if you've watched this film on the Academy, you'll know that the baby's full of laughs and giggles by the time this shot is done. But it's about nailing everybody's energy in the photograph. If you are going to be a lifestyle photographer, you need to absolutely bring everybody's expression. And the way that I do that, I tend to actually do it through play. Similar here, though, in a high key kind of environment. In this case, this is a roll of vinyl coming down the wall and across the floor. And it's got two lights actually onto the background. It's got one key light onto them, and pretty much we're nailing that. As a rule, I want the background light to be twice as bright as the front light. So in other words, if I'm working on f8 or f11, let's keep to f8 for now as far as my aperture is concerned. If I'm working on f8 as my working aperture is concerned, then my background lights would be metered to 2 stops more, which would be the f16. And that will then deliver me a portrait that will easily print with no real corrections. If you find that your backgrounds are a little bit dirty white, then clean them up, because there's nothing worse than getting it back from your framers and there's a bit of detail in the white, a little bit of grey noise and everything else within things. But this picture is really about the emotion rather than anything else. Same family, that's the baby in the middle. But, you know, I love the idea of kind of silhouette element as well, where we can basically completely just switch off the front light fully, concentrate on the background light and kind of really get the profiles giving some real energy to create a difference. Now, some clients will think this is amazing and this is going to be the big image for the wall. Others are going to want to see the face and they're going to want to see themselves. And that's the one they're going to be buying for the wall. You know, my job is not to think too much about what they're going to buy for the wall. My job is to deliver a family portrait experience they'll never forget and they want to come back to me and have it done time and time again. We talked about the kind of bringing what they do together. This family is involved with theatre and everything else with it. They had these amazing puppets that they brought in. So again, using them as a part of the theme, and it got a little bit mad, I'm telling you now, this session where all the characters were kind of beginning to interact together and almost the family were secondary and things really. But even in small spaces, you can create storytelling elements. You know, if you're a photographer and you've got to work on location, this image could be the same if you're photographing low and the client is up high and perhaps the sky is your background, but try and get the big energy going on and try and make sure the sun is falling onto them so you can get deep blue skies and everything else. Or shoot in the reverse of that, where basically you're shooting high up and down. So perhaps you take a step ladder along with you and you've got the sunlight coming in from behind and then you're just using the likes of a reflector to bounce some of the light back in. Whatever it is, you know, find what is right for you. The sisters shooting things, bringing their props in, you know, one's a dancer, one's into sport, one's a painter. These things are all the difference with it. You know, when a mum comes in and she says, look, we dress up as a lot. It's me and the two kids. This is what we do for fun. It's like, well, bring loads in. And oh yeah, they did bring in loads and things, but having that little bit of fun, but then I've got to bring the energy in. So how I bring out the character is being interested in them. And I think that in the world of portrait family photography, too many times the photographer is not thinking about the subject and who they are. They're instead kind of really trying to just put the subject into an easy scene where they can concentrate on the expressions more. And I would obviously encourage you more and more to look at how they interact together, how they have a little bit of fun. And it's not really relying all the time on big propping or big colors, but instead, you know, big people, big animation to create the kind of fun images that we're going through. But at the end of the day, as I said, the first thing and the last thing is always going to be an expression. And if you can nail that expression, your family photography is going to be well received by them. On the other hand, if you can combine good animation, good lighting with the beautiful expressions and bringing out the emotion with it, you really don't need to actually develop your family photography anymore and things really. And I really look forward to seeing images that you create through the kind of photo critiques and everything else with it. Anyway, good luck with your family photography.